Welcome to another episode of Faithfully Podcast, the flagship podcast of Faithfully Magazine, owned and operated by Faithfully Media. I'm Nicola A. Menzi, managing editor of faithfullymagazine.com. In this episode, you'll hear my conversation with Dr. Louis A. DeCaro Jr. about his most recent book, titled The Untold Story of Shields Green, The Life and Death of a Harper's Ferry Raider. DeCaro is Associate Professor of Church History at Alliance Theological Seminary in New York City. He is the author of several books, including biographical works on Christian abolitionist John Brown and Muslim minister and activist Malcolm X. DeCaro has also served as an advisor to Faithfully Magazine. In The Untold Story of Shields Green, DeCaro pieces together a biography of sorts of one of the few black men who joined abolitionist John Brown in his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in 1859, a key event leading up to the Civil War. Let's listen.
Shields
Thank
Green is pretty interesting.
Yes, he's a very interesting guy, and I'm glad that I got drawn into working on his life because honestly, I had met. I figured that with my work, there's just so much to do. I figured the Raiders would be something that I would leave to other people to do.
Right.
And then, as I mentioned, that I just thought I'd write an article because a couple of years ago there was a lot of excitement about movies coming. At least excitement for John Brown people. There was those movie and the Good Lord Bird thing coming up, and but the movie about Shields Green is what prompted me to. Well, I'll write a little article because I know I've got tons of stuff. And when I actually started digging in, as I shared, I actually found I didn't have tons of stuff, but I did have bits and pieces. And the more I looked at them, the more I thought this was interesting. So I just began to do research, and that's what happened with the book. So it literally kind of happened one evening, just the whole event. And then once I got all my material together, I think I wrote 100 pages. We just wrote 100 pages, and then NYU Press said, let's do a book. And then I got serious about the research. But I still hope that there's going to be some breakthroughs, whether it confirms what I found or not. But he's kind of now, he's like my favorite. He's like my favorite figure.
And not above John Brown, though. I can't imagine.
Well, it's kind, yeah. I mean, but as far as the Raiders are concerned, I think for me, he's kind of the unsung hero. And in some ways, he's not doing it as far as I know. He didn't go back in, even though he had a son down south. I don't know that he went down to liberate his son. I think he really went in, like I share. I think he was a real freedom fighter. I think he was an unsung freedom fighter, and I think that's why he even enlisted. So.
But before we get too deep into some of that, just give a very brief biographical sketch, of who is Shields Green. And I'm thinking specifically also maybe before, he encounters John Brown and participates in the raid.
Okay. My understanding, and now this is the sketchy part, is that we really don't have a lot of information, but
right.
As I put the pieces together, and I try to be tentative about it, definite but tentative. Like I use in the book, I use the analogy of solid lines and dotted lines because when you don't have a lot of information, then you sort of use dotted lines to connect pieces. So my combination of solid lines and dotted lines is that he was born about 1825 in South Carolina. That he was a free man of color, which opens up really a whole world of discussion because we often think of slavery in the South, but we don't often think of the fact that there was a significant population in the lower South, no less, of people who were free people of color. But unlike many free people of color, he was a man of dark complexion. And so he dealt with not only the reality of racism and white supremacy on one hand, but he probably dealt with a measure of colorism on the other. And I do believe he was free. And this is really based on maybe one of the few, I think, really reliable pieces that come from his own mouth, where he actually told people he was free. I don't think he told people he was free to try to outsmart anybody. I think that he actually made the admission after he was convicted and being prepared to hang. So he said that his parents were free in South Carolina. And this has, of course, set me on a path to try to find out who his parents were. I have not been able to do so yet. There's some argument over whether his real name was Shields Green. I happen to think it was Shields Green. So he was born a free man in Charleston, South Carolina. That he was also believed that was a little older than most people assume. They usually portray him as a man of 20. He was a man with melanin, so he was mistaken for being younger in some respects. But I feel that he was born about 1825. I believe that he slipped out of Charleston, either because he, really literally escaped, but escaped in the sense of that he wanted to get out of the South with the intention of slipping back in, possibly, because again, he was a free status, or because the state of existence for free people of color was extremely tenuous and difficult, because unless they had money and resources, they could easily be thrown into jail, could be turned into virtual enslavement, brought into virtual enslavement over debts. Of course, the police probably and the public, the white public, probably made their lives miserable. So they could be thrown into jail, into the Charleston jail. It's very possible that there is a quote where he said that he was beaten, that he was whipped. I suspect he wasn't whipped as a slave, but the traditional notion, even among Black scholars like the late, great Benjamin Quarles, was that he was born a slave. I think that he was born a free man, but he was subjected to the extremely blatant system of white supremacy. I think he got sick of it. I think he wanted to do something about it, and he ran away. That's my thesis. Yes.
Can I interject there for a minute? So,
sure.
You're a scholar, you're doing your research. So as you're weighing, what kind of information to follow, to go with, you see some who suspect that he was enslaved, maybe a runaway slave. You're saying, no, you're taking him at his word, perhaps, that he was a free man.
Yes.
But how does the evidence weigh up in terms of that? Are you just making that decision based on his word, or is there really good competing evidence to suggest there is a strong possibility that?
Well, that's a good question. In my estimation, and it's not hard. Like, this is not a hill to die on, but it's a hill to kind of take a stand to look. And my perspective is there isn't enough evidence to prove he was a slave beyond what he said. Everybody sort of says he was a slave, but he never says he was a slave. And interestingly enough, none of the little evidence of people talking about him initially really suggests he was a slave. Like, it seems to be assumed by everybody that because he ran away, because he was from the South, and frankly, because he was a dark-skinned man, they made a lot of assumptions about him. And the later in the 19th century you got, the more racist it got. Even among the people who were supposedly for John Brown, they characterized him a certain way. It's possible he was born in slavery, but they haven't been able to find evidence either. There was a gentleman who did a book about the 5 Black Raiders, and he speculated that he was owned by a certain person. He found somebody who owned a plantation, and he went down that road. But the problem is he couldn't prove that. There was no documentation that he had a young man, or he had a man by that name. So the fact of the matter is, it could break either way. If somebody finds some information, it might, change it. And when I wrote the book, I really make the point to say, other people might find this, but this is what I see, and I'm going by. I want to respect what Emperor said himself. And so I'm going to take him at his word. Was he maybe possibly saying something that wasn't true? It's possible. But again, I had to weigh when that statement was made. And the statement was made in a very rare very rare interview, not just with him, but with all the Raiders who were on death row, by a Virginian who came through the prison. A lot of people went through the jail cell and met the Raiders, antagonize them, interrogate them, question them, just to look at them. And so this particular interview was done later in the imprisonment. So again, I am kind of privileging that statement because I believe it's authentic. The man who said it was a racist Southerner. And he's very blunt about everything he says. He describes him not in a mean way, but he describes him, just as tough, as strong, and that he said this. And so if that's what he wrote, then I'm going to just say, until I'm proven otherwise, this is the characterization. And then there were little things that made me feel like possibly it was the case. For instance, he was described by many, not all, but by many, as being very intelligent. He seems to have perhaps been able to read. He had certain professions when he escaped. And by the way, he seemed to have sequestered himself, or had himself sequestered, on a boat that sailed from Charleston. And so my surmise is it went from Charleston to New York City. Maybe it was carrying cotton. I don't know what it was carrying, but he got there. That was an interesting question, because how did he do that? One of the possible theories is he was thrown into jail, maybe over debt, and he was beaten and probably was going to be sent into slavery, because this is what happened to a lot of free Black men and women. And rather than accepting that, he arranged something. And it may have been through Black seamen, Black mariners, who got him out. That's kind of I think, a relatively good thesis. And as I mentioned in the book, the Southerners by the 1850s had really become very wary of Black mariners. They weren't in the 1820s, but they had actually set up laws and different ways to. And so if a Black mariner who was not a slave, which is interesting, if he was free and he came into Charleston, they put him in jail.
Okay.
So is it possible that he came into contact with a Black mariner, that he made arrangements, or in some other way got himself onto a boat, got himself north? And then that's another interesting thing. Most of the narratives are very simplistic or reductionist. They have him running to Canada because we know he was in Canada. But then he said something else he says it more than once in interviews. Mm-hmm. He says he was involved in stuff going on in Harrisburg. So I got curious about that. Some kind of riots. White people would say anything time Black people fighting for the freedom, they're riots. So there were these riots that he was supposedly part of in Harrisburg, and I started digging to try to find out when these took place. And lo and behold, they took place in 1850. 1850, even before the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, the second Fugitive Slave Act, which was really just a monstrously wicked piece of legislation that was passed in the fall of 1850. And he was apparently one of the leading spirits in resisting people, white marshals or white slaveholders in Harrisburg. And a riot that I found had taken place in 1850 prior to the actual passing of the Fugitive Slave Act. So he said that he was in Harrisburg. And so again, I'm going to try to put in some dotted lines there and say he may have gone from New York to Philadelphia, or maybe he took a boat to Philadelphia. I just don't know. I think it's New York. But Philadelphia was connected to Harrisburg. Of course, they're both Pennsylvania cities. But according to one source on the Underground Railroad, a scholar of the Underground Railroad, said that there was actually a constant traffic, an Underground Railroad connection between Philadelphia and Harrisburg. And Harrisburg had a vibrant Black community in the 1850s, made up of free Black people and fugitives. So it kind of makes sense that he might have ended up there. So now my dotted lines bring him from escape to New York and or Philadelphia, probably New York to Philadelphia, and then Philadelphia to Harrisburg. He's militant. He's strong. He wants to fight. He gets involved. He resists some incident where a bunch of guys who had run from the South, where they tried to capture them. Some of them were recaptured and sent back into slavery, unfortunately, after actually the passing of the Fugitive Slave Law then passed. But some of them were able to escape. He was not one of those people, but I think he may have been in the vanguard. This is a possibility. And then I think from there, he went to Rochester. He probably went to Rochester, New York, attracted to Frederick Douglass. That's my theory, I think. And Frederick Douglass was a beacon in the night. He welcomed a lot of enslaved people to his door. He took care of them, he and his wife. He wasn't just a rhetorician, although he was that. He was probably the superlative orator of the 19th century, bar none. And we can get into Douglass because he's just mind blowing. But let's say that it looks like he went there because Douglass, who's a little bit kind of conflationary, is that a word? He conflates a lot in his autobiography. He says that he was in his home. There was some kind of nasty gossip that he liked one of Douglass's daughter, Rosetta, who would have been a little younger than him, but it doesn't mean he couldn't have liked her. And then he goes to Canada, and we don't know where in Canada, but my guess is he went across from Rochester, went into Canada at that point, and he was in what was called Ontario, and what's called Ontario was called Canada West in the 19th century. He must have stayed there. So my guess is he ran away in 1850. I don't know how long. At some point, he was in Rochester. And then I believe, according to one reliable article that was written in Rochester after the raid, he had lived in Canada for a couple of years. My surmise is from about 1856 to about 1858. And then he came from Canada. Now, what's interesting about that is that most Black people who were looking at Canada were running from the United States to Canada by that time, because not only now, mind you, had the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which basically said nowhere in the country is safe for a fugitive from slavery. The judges will be paid more, will favor returning people to slavery. Black people who are put on trial can't speak. Just all this just horrible injustice that is so typical of the history of the country is really personified almost in this act. Then 1857, and is the infamous Dred Scott decision, which even tested the extent to which an enslaved person can remain a slave in a free state, and the ruling was he's not free even in a free state. And so no wonder huge numbers of Black people began to expatriate to Canada, the land of freedom. So what's interesting is Shields Green comes into the United States. So then the question is, why does he come back?
Let's pause there for a minute. And just to synthesize a bit here, because I want to build a sketch of Shields Green. So you're saying he was most likely a free Black American. In his 30s, at the time, at least, of the raid, and when he's actually speaking to other sources who are documenting things about him in his 30s, from South Carolina. Um, and I know in your book you say, I don't think you just mentioned it, but in your book, you mentioned that he had a son at the time, and so also most likely a wife, whom he left, or perhaps I think you speculate also that she maybe might have
Yes.
died at some point.
Yes.
And so he's in his 30s, married, has a young son from South Carolina. You say he's a bit militant, he's bothered, of course, obviously, by what's going on in the country concerning Black Americans. So he's looking to do something if he hasn't already started participating in some activities. And then he's also a gentleman of darker complexion. So a lot of things are assumed about him and, said about him. So
Very good. Yes.
That's Shields Green by the time, he's encountering John Brown. And does he first meet John Brown through Douglas? Like, how does he first connect with John Brown?
That's definitely, how he met him. I think we can almost pinpoint that he met him in April of 1859. He probably wanted to meet Brown. Now, this is another theory. John Brown went to Canada in 1858, in the spring of 1858. He was helped by Harriet Tubman. And those two were like, they really took to each other. It's an amazing story. But Harriet Tubman was going to help him. And he traveled along the railroad through Ontario from adjacent to New York to, let's say, Buffalo, Niagara Falls, New York, all the way over to Chatham, Ontario, which is adjacent to Detroit, Michigan. And in that whole, he actually was stopping to recruit Black men because he had financial resources in 1858. He didn't have the kind of manpower. He wanted to get Black men. Harriet Tubman was completely sold on his plan, and she was going to help him. But he did not meet Shields Green in 1858. And I'm pretty sure about that, because if he had met him, he would have been in attendance at John Brown's Chatham Conference, which was a secret convention in May of 1858. And there were about 35, I can't remember the number, of people there, some of his own men, a small number of his own men, mostly Black Americans who were either coming across the border from Detroit or who were expatriates, or I don't want to, it's fugitives, but they were people who had really, had good reason to say, bunk the United States, I'm finished and I'm going to Canada. And so he gathered this group of people who were very gracious to join him. But Shields Green is not in the list. So my theory is Shields Green heard about it and he wanted to get a piece of his action. And so he wanted to connect with John Brown. But what happened was in 1858, John Brown's plans were almost betrayed by a man in his number that through the whole operation went sideways. He had to go to Kansas. He had to pretend like he was not planning anything in the East. And he lost the whole year. He also lost a lot of help in that time. He lost interest. Things intervened. The great abolitionist Martin Delany, one of the fathers of Black nationalism, in the 19th century, Delany was supporting him in May of 58, but by, I think, 1859, Delany was thinking about himself exploring West Africa, and just a lot of things intervened. Even Harriet Tubman was never able to kind of recoup support. But Shields Green, I think, again, it's a measure of his zeal, is that he found an opportunity. So he came back. It looks like he came back into Rochester. He took over a business. He published, his card was published, his professional card was published in the Rochester Democrat, stating that he was a clothes cleaner. Basically, he's doing this work of this kind of work that unfortunately, it's derogatory, but it represented a class of work that many Black people did, even in the free states. Things like hairdressing or hair cutting, barbering, cleaning clothes, doing kind of more, what should we say, domestic level professions where they were able to be business people. And he somehow took over, I don't know the connection, but he took over a clothes cleaning business, advertised locally. This is why I also think, he's not illiterate. He seems to have been able to read, which again is a point in favor of the free, being born free, and maybe of having had at least some schooling. And so, his card is published. And then when John Brown comes in the spring of '59, he comes to Douglas's house in town and he meets John Brown. And then by August of '59, Shields Green is brought by Frederick Douglass down to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, where he meets with Brown. And Douglass was actually not wanting Shields Green to join Brown. He was actually against it.
Yeah, I want to interrupt you there on that point, yes. The Douglass thing, because I found it interesting and I was curious. I was wondering, and I think you might have alluded to it when you mentioned, Harriet Tubman wanting to support Brown. But in Tubman's case, I guess my question is, in what way would have Douglass provided support to Brown? Was it financially? Was it, encouraging other Black men to participate? In what way was Douglass thinking of supporting Brown?
Well, that's a very good question. And a lot of people think that it was that he wanted to bring Douglass into the field. But actually, that's not the case.
I found that kind of amusing. Douglass wasn't at all like that, right? As compared to like Tubman, obviously.
That's right. He was not. As a matter of fact, by the 1850s, Douglass had some health problems. He had problems where sometimes he couldn't get out of bed. He had trouble with his legs and he had trouble with his feet. As a matter of fact, I met one of Frederick Douglass's direct great grandsons who told me that there's a family story that Douglass could show his grandchildren the bottoms of his feet, and he could stick a writing pen into the cracks that were at the bottom of his feet as a result of the life in slavery that he lived with. He lived with health issues. I mean, he was a strapping and handsome man, and I think generally healthy. I mean, he lived to be an old man, but he suffered from some conditions that made it difficult. And by 1859, you see, they met in the 1840s. And at that time, John Brown's ideas probably had evolved from that time. But in the beginning, he probably saw this young man and he wanted him to enlist. But by the 1850s, Frederick Douglass's star had risen amazingly. Frederick Douglass, and we tend to just think of Douglass as famous, but he was a rock star. I mean, he was a rock star on both sides of the Atlantic. He was probably the most prominent orator, in the United States, even next to some of the white orators. He was really something. And so by 1859, John Brown doesn't want him to come into the field. He wants him to recruit. He wants him to put the Frederick Douglass approval stamp on his mission. And that is the source of tensions between the two men, because by 1859, Douglass does not want to support what Brown has added to his plan. Douglass liked Brown's plan from the 1840s, but Brown decided to do one additional thing, which was he wanted to make a demonstration and seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry. And Douglass was against that. Now, Douglass, as I said, he conflated things. All autobiography, as stylizes to some degree. We know this from St. Augustine to Malcolm X. Everybody who writes their own story is going to tell things, not lie, but they're not going to necessarily tell every detail. Sometimes there's stuff that you're embarrassed to talk about, and sometimes it's too much to talk about, so you conflate. And what Douglas did was he conflated actually 3 different meetings with John Brown in 1859, and he conflated them into one meeting. And this has been something that I've been able to weed out and tease out, and with the help of some associates. But they met in April. They met in March. Excuse me. First in March of '59 in Detroit, and they had a clash. They really had a clash. Now, keep in mind, these are old friends. John Brown was the older of the two, and John Brown was kind of imperious. Some people have said he was treating Douglas badly as a black man. I don't think so. I think that he was, because it was really his personality. He wanted Douglas to assent, and Douglas wouldn't, and they clashed. In April, they made up. That's the time they made up, and Brown went to Douglas, and I think he made good with him, and kind of restored whatever, mended the fences. That's at the point when he introduced Shields Green. Then they met in Chambersburg in August of '59, and that's when Green famously said, "I'm going to go with the old man," much to Douglas's surprise and dismay. And then they met, and this is what Douglas doesn't talk about. They met in Philadelphia in September of '59. So this is like a month before the Harper's Ferry raid. And Douglas comes down. He doesn't talk about this because I think it was a hard episode for him. He comes down. He meets with Brown. He meets with the black leaders and community leaders in Philadelphia, which was a significant black population. And there was a black company of I would maybe call it a rifle company, or kind of an organized group of men who wanted to go with Brown. And they wanted Douglas to kind of lead the way. And they wrote to him and asked him to at least kind of, I think, start them off, and that they would make sure that he was covered and all this kind of stuff. And he refused. He refused to help. And this really was devastating for John Brown. John Brown went back to Maryland, where his headquarters was. Douglas went back to Rochester. And by then, also, he lost touch with Harriet Tubman. But the one kind of light in the darkness for John Brown from that whole affair was Emperor. Emperor was there. So again, my argument is that the only reason why Emperor was with John Brown was because Emperor wanted to be involved, because Douglas was not encouraging him. And right or wrong, I'm at my point, we can debate, we can talk about whether or not Douglas was more right than Brown on this issue. And we obviously don't have time to talk about what the whole idea of the raid was. We can touch on it if you want. But the point really is that Douglas had his views, Brown had his views. They loved each other, but they disagreed. And Green sided with Brown. Shields Green went with John Brown, and the rest was history.
And so, you mentioned there briefly in the book, I think it's John Brown's daughter-in-law, Anne, had suggested or alleged that actually Douglas had hired Green or offered to pay Green to go in his place. Yes. But you say that's unlikely.
No. She said that very late in life. She was a cranky woman. Okay. And I think that that was. Now the thing is, you have to tease out truth sometimes from this kind of talk. Mm-hmm. But no, I definitely don't think that there was any basis in that. But what you can't take away from Anne Brown was that she was a 16-year-old girl. She lived at the Kennedy farm in Maryland with John Brown and all the raiders. And she's the one who gives us some of the most vital information we do have, which was that he escaped from South Carolina on a boat, that he had a child, that he was a widower. So I don't throw her out completely, but I also look at what she said in the 1850s and in 60s versus what she said in the 1890s. Okay, when I think she got more cranky.
Okay, yeah. And going into the raid a little bit, I think it was on a Sunday, like Sunday evening, overnight, that it unfolded. Night. And, reading your account, and you're very good at, breaking down the action, so to speak. And, Brown was almost successful, it seemed. But then, I don't know, he started expressing a lot of, not sympathy, but a lot of care for the locals in terms of, I think he had captured some folks and they were hostages in a sense,
Yeah.
but he
Yes.
wanted to treat them kindly.
Yeah.
And so that kind of waylaid plans a bit, or expectations maybe, for the raiders who were with him.
Yes.
And the gunfight ensues and all of that overnight. But then I found it also interesting that as everyone becomes aware of what's happening with the raid, that even some of the locals, obviously, who were upset, there were still some who were also sympathetic toward Brown. So I'm wondering, what was that dynamic there that, Brown was putting in so much care to make sure, none of the locals got hurt. And then you had some of the locals who were, yes, they were upset, but still sympathetic toward him. What was going on there?
Well, maybe the sympathy they felt for him was kind of after the fact, in realizing that he was not. I mean, I think that point is important only because John Brown, by white society, is typically portrayed as a terrorist. And if he was a terrorist, he was a lousy terrorist. He was like, I don't think that he was a terrorist. I think that what he did not anticipate. The other thing too is that he's an extremely ponderous person, and he wanted to affect a quote unquote legal approach to this. So he went in, he seized Harper's Ferry, as you mentioned, on a Sunday night. He held it, and he could have, and he began to gather enslaved people from the community. He was able to hold everything at the armory, but he stayed too long. And the reason he stayed too long, as you're saying, was because he was negotiating with Virginians, and he wanted to do actually what looks like legal exchanges on paper. Fugitives exchanged for hostages. Enslaved people exchanged for hostages. He should have just taken the hostages, taken the enslaved people, and just gone into the mountains. Why he didn't do that speaks a lot to his own sense of propriety. He wanted to do things in a very legal framework. He wanted to leave a paper trail. He wanted people to see that he did this in a way that reflected a sense of his Christian duty and his legality, which, in my opinion, he should have let that go, and he should have just grabbed people and gone. He didn't do that. And so he got delayed. And as you mentioned, he also kind of was concerned precisely because this is where he doesn't get credited as being a Christian man. He did not want to be a source of terror. He wanted to be understood that his presence there was a Christian liberationist effort, that he did not want to strike terror or kill people, because we do have insurrections. We had Nat Turner. We had a number of other very small, not as big as Nat Turner, but took place where, basically enslaved people understood that the only way we're going to be free is if we wipe out our masters. Then we're legally free. John Brown actually was trying to steer between that and simply Underground Railroad work. So what he came up with was a plan to kind of arm the Underground Railroad and work out of the mountain systems and gather people as he could to destabilize slavery. That was his plan. But he never really launched the plan because he got flummoxed right in Harper's Ferry, and he never got off the ground. And unfortunately, and he said this in a number of his letters afterward, he says that he made this terrible mistake, and it cost the lives of the men who were with him, including Shields Green's life. So it's a mistake, but it's really a mistake of, this is a guy who really was not the hardcore, bloodthirsty, fanatical killer that white historians have made him out to be. If anything, he erred on the side of the golden rule, in my opinion. So my understanding of Brown goes very against the typical drive-by biographies that are written about Brown, but they haven't really studied the man and who he was. But he messed up. And the Black Raider Osborne Anderson said this in his 1861 book. He said if Brown had thought more at that moment of the enterprise of the enslaved people than he was worried about his hostages, things would have turned out differently. So that's a rebuke, and that is something that is to be laid at the doorstep of John Brown, that he shot himself in the foot, and he actually never started the plan he'd been working on for over 20 years because of this.
And I'm curious also if you could just quickly note, like, why Virginia and why Harper's Ferry? I know Virginia at one point like had the most number of slaves, right, among the other colonies or states.
Yeah.
So why was it Virginia and why was it Harper's Ferry in particular?
Well, Virginia, you're right. Well, Virginia is one of the major states. Of course, it was not in the deep South, and so it was an entrance into the South. It had to do with the geography, the terrain. That where he went in was actually Western Virginia. It's today in West Virginia. It's not, because Lincoln created West Virginia in 1863. In 1859, it was Western Virginia. So he chose that because there's immediate access to the Appalachians, to what they were called the Allegheny Mountains, but this part of the Appalachian system, easy access. He wanted to go at Virginia because Virginia was the Old Dominion. It was the sort of the beating heart of the South, as well as the beating heart of the Revolution. He wanted to make a statement by going after the Old Dominion, but he also wanted to go into the gateway into the South. And Harper's Ferry was interesting because it was the only federal armory. Now, there were arsenals all over the country, but it's the only federal armory where they produced weapons in the South. And so he wanted to seize Harper's Ferry. And this is where I go against the grain of popular assumption. They say he wanted to take the weapons. That is not the case. Brown himself denied it. And as I argue in the book, he makes no effort to take any weapons at all. What he was doing was making a demonstration. And the reason was, I found this, and again, I mean, I'm tooting my own horn, but I'm grateful for this work because it drove me, deeper into looking at this. What had happened was the Southerners had raided an arsenal in Missouri, and the federal government, which was pro-slavery inclined, never prosecuted those people for stealing weapons from an arsenal in Missouri and using them against free state people. That happened while John Brown was out in Kansas. So I believe that when he came back from Kansas, he has an attitude of, I'm going to show you. I'm going to seize a federal armory. I'm going to rally the enslaved people, and then I'm going to make my way into the mountains. And from there, he has access through the Allegheny system that stretches all the way down into the Carolinas. And as James Redpath says, one of his early biographers said, he wanted to bring this from Virginia to the Gulf of Mexico. He wanted to completely shake up and traumatize not Southern people, not white people. He wanted to traumatize the operations of slavery. He wanted to completely throw them off by drawing people away and then arming them and putting them in the mountains. And once you get into the Alleghenies, you can either go north or you can go deeper into the South. And so that was the plan. And that was why he went at Harper's Ferry. And he'd been looking at Harper's Ferry. I can prove that he was in Harper's Ferry looking as early as 1840. So this is a plan that he really was, he was letting it ferment for a good number of years. But it was that Harper's Ferry armory piece that was 1856 is when he added that piece. And that's also the piece that created problems with him and Douglas.
Right.
So
and so, they fail. They get arrested. And so talk a little bit about, I guess, the picture you're left to paint of Shields Green, like his demeanor. He's captured. He's going to be executed. He knows this, of course. But how is he during his imprisonment and his trial? Like, does he seem to maintain that same composure, or does he seem regretful in some sense?
Overall, he's amazingly strong. I mean, now he did from the beginning, and we know that when the Marines broke through the engine house, which is where John Brown and his men had holed up at the end, he was smart. So this guy thinks on his toes. So what he did was he dropped all his weapons, and now he stands with a group of black men who were enslaved men, and he tried to put himself in with them in the hopes that he could slip out. That if they seized him, because it's interesting to point out when the Marines attacked John Brown, they were not attacking as U.S. Marines. They were attacking as instruments of the slaveholders. And Robert E. Lee, who commanded that group, told them, "Don't harm the enslaved people. You can kill all the white raiders, because they were insurrectionists, but don't hurt." And they don't say don't hurt the black people. They say don't hurt the property.
Right.
So Shields Green is like, okay, I drop my weapon, I throw down my belt, and now, when the Marines bust in, they won't know me from, they won't know who I am. So I'll try to pass this. That didn't work, because he was exposed by the hostages, who said, and he had been a brave fighter. He had been shooting. He had been fighting. He was a brave man. He went into this posture. I think it was all act of crying and pleading and begging and saying that he was at first that he was another slave. Then he started crying out and saying that he, trying to make excuses and and then that didn't work. And once that didn't work, and he was arrested and sent to Charlestown, I believe his whole expression, his whole presentation then was that he faced situations. So there was an attempt on his part, as long as he could try to find some way to get out of it, which is reasonable. He tried. When that didn't work, then the little evidence we have of him in jail was that, certainly up until the time of his death, that he was not crying and pleading, and he was just simply a man who was facing death. It does seem that he did have a conversion experience, or he did take the comforts of a local clergyman, and that he did. I think through a Methodist tradition, I think that he did, commit his life to Christ. That's my words, but that appears to be what happened. But that's not an unreasonable thing for somebody to do who's facing death and who probably had a background in the church, or was exposed to the church, but had not been walking. Maybe he had not been walking in the faith. I don't know. We don't know. But he's always seems to be, from what little we know, he seems to be, therefore, a man who is afraid when it's understandable that he was afraid. And what most people, for instance, who know this story don't talk about is when the men were captured at Harper's Ferry, there was a great chance that they would have been lynched immediately. John Brown, as well as all the raiders, would have been killed by vigilantes. They were surrounded. The only reason that they survived to go to jail and to be put on trial was because the U.S. Marines, who had arrested them, would put them down, protected them from the mobs. There were nothing but mob violence. So Shields Green had good reason to be afraid. John Brown was afraid. We know that they were afraid. John Brown was afraid of dying at a lynch mob because he wanted to bear witness. And I think Shields Green had the same. I think he wanted to make the best appearance he could, because if he couldn't win, he wanted to lose with a sense of dignity. And that was the point about the images that I made. That's kind of, in some ways, my favorite part of the book, because I gathered all the sketches. Now, as I mentioned in the book, he's the only Harper's Ferry raider of whom we have no early photographic image. Everybody else, in all the black men as well, the other black men who were involved, John Brown, his sons, all the Raiders, all of them, we have an actual photograph of them. Well, they called them daguerreotypes in those days, but they were glass plate, photographs. We don't have a photograph of Emperor. We have this sketch. And the one that historians always use is the crestfallen, I'm down and out. But that was made right after he was arrested. And what happens in the reportage is that they always portray him negatively. They always portray him, and they're very emphatic about how dark he is. Everything is that dark. He's the darkest. He's dark. So there's this real, just blatant kind of racism that comes out, that because he's dark, and he's the most, he's afraid, and all this kind of thing. And then even the sketch artists who portray him, and as I argue in there, of the 4 sketches we have of him, he's always defeated. He's always downcast. He's always, except for one, and that one is actually part of a larger sketch of him in the jail cell with another black raider, John Anthony Copeland, and one of the white raiders. And it caught my eye because he sketched him sitting on his bed, and he has his hand in his, like they used to do in the 19th century, which was a hangover from I guess portrait days, the painting portrait days. He has his sitting on the bed, and he's got his hand like this, and he's got a certain look of. And I said, this artist, and I even try to think about the white artists who captured these people. And I said, but this is probably the best image we have of Emperor, because this is a man with dignity, with self-assurance, and he's, I believe, striking a pose for the sketch artist. He wants the sketch artist to remember him this way. And so that's why at the end, I blew that up, and I want history to remember him that way, because I think that is the way Shields Green wants us to remember him. I don't think it's with this man who's like, oh, I've been beaten, I'm afraid I'm going to die, blah, blah, blah. We all go through that. If we were in the middle of a war, we'd all look like, you know what.
Right.
But this was the man, and I think it reflects who he was, that he was a man of integrity. He was a man of bravery. He was a man who was willing to fight. He's not remembered. Why? I hope that I can, do something that he can be remembered again. And I think, we've done a little bit of work in that regard. So.
And winding down real quickly, could you mention or discuss, because you mentioned in the book, there are a group of clergymen, I believe, from Philadelphia, who write into the Virginia governor or whoever the local leader is who has the decisive power to ask for mercy, for Copeland and Green. But of course, I think they probably expect they will be executed anyway. So they're asking, at least then, could we have the bodies? Could we receive the bodies? So I have a couple questions about that. But first, who were some of these religious leaders? Do you know?
You know what? I should have read my book, because I think I've forgotten. But they were leading, I think, Episcopal and Baptist black leaders in Philadelphia, as you mentioned. They were, their names are mentioned when the letter is published. It was a letter to the governor, but I at least tried to find out how they were, and I found out they were all leading men of the churches, the black churches.
Okay.
And so.
Was that common though? Like, why were they? I'm guessing because it was John Brown related. This was big news, and the simple act of what they did was big news. But why specifically were they interested in Green and Copeland? Or am I forgetting? Like you said, there were 5 black raiders. So did the other 3 escape? Is that what happened?
Yeah, good question. One of them was Dangerfield Newby, was killed in the action. Another, Osborne Anderson, who actually was a Pennsylvanian who lived in Canada, was able to escape and get back to Canada. So he wasn't present. And then let's see, who was I'm blanking now. on my.
Okay. Do you
I'm
remember
sorry.
at least? That's all right. You don't have to remember the name exactly, but do you remember what likely happened to this fifth person?
It would be death. I'm just trying. I'm
Yes.
embarrassed
Okay.
to say. I'm kind of trying to remember. Oh, it's Lou. Yeah, it just came back. Louis Leary, who was from Oberlin, Ohio, and Louis. In fact, this is something else that I found out. Louis was murdered. He was taken prisoner, and he was murdered. Typically, they say he was wounded and he died of his wound, but I found firsthand journalistic testimony that his throat was cut by an angry white man, which is very, so
that's an interesting wound.
Yes, it is. Yeah. So he was murdered, and so those three brothers died, and so we have John Anthony, who was from Oberlin, and Shields Green were the object of interest to the Black community because they were incarcerated, and because the Black community recognized, probably immediately, that all the attention was being given to John Brown. And in fairness, of course, even John Brown's white raiders were not given the attention John Brown was, but the Black raiders were particularly, neglected, or when they were spoken of. And this gets back to how Emperor was spoken of. He was spoken of with contempt. And during his trial, by the way, we don't have a good record of the trials. But during his trial, the prosecuting attorney, who was a slaveholder, began to unleash a furious tirade against him simply because he had shown an interest in a so-called mulatto woman who was on one of the plantations. And the actual record was that he was just concerned about her, and he was trying to actually perhaps talk her into either joining the group or talk her out of joining the group. I don't know. But because he had shown an interest in this woman, as if he didn't have a right to, the slaveholder, who was himself, who held Black women as his property, he just vents his rage against Shields Green, and the undercover New York Tribune correspondent, the only anti-slavery man on site, tells us that he was amazed at how Emperor held his composure under this kind of abuse. So it's a snapshot, again, of a man of a great deal of self-control, and he didn't go to pieces. He stood his ground. So the Black community wanted to at least have their bodies, and of course, as I mentioned, John Anthony's family, Copeland's in Oberlin, Ohio, were begging the governor to get their son's body back, and the governor, he didn't really care.
Right, of course.
And as I mentioned, the bodies were immediately, they were hanged and buried on the site of the gallows. And before the bodies, as they literally say, before the bodies got cold, a group of medical students from Winchester, Virginia, came and stole the bodies and brought them to the medical school for dissection. And that is not something unusual. I think one of the ugly realities of white supremacy and racism is that Black bodies have not only been exploited and abused in life, but even in death, Black bodies have been subjects.
Yeah, I have to say that part of the account really just kind of hit me over the head. And as you said, the bodies weren't even in the ground for a day before the medical students came and dug them up. And then, of course, I'm wondering, why bother even burying them then if everyone knows what's going to likely happen? And related to that too, the fact that, I believe it was Copeland's family who sent someone on site to try at least to get, something worked out. And they just, I guess, deceived him, or, sent him in circles to the point where he just had to leave empty-handed. But then you mentioned also 20 years later, there's an advertisement about some local, I guess you would say in this day and age, like a department store. Saying, they have Shield Green's, is it his head? Was it supposedly on display for public view? Can you just mention that a little bit? Like
Yeah.
how
You know, and what's amazing is these little bits that compose my my closing of the book, and that piece, just one little piece in a Southern newspaper that apparently was reprinted in a number of other papers. And you're right, they had the skull. So this is 1882, and they were displaying the skull in what, as you said, like a department store. It was like, it would be sort of like a drugstore today, but a drugstore kind of wholesale place that also, I contacted people down who were local historians who said in those days they were also kind of cultural centers. So they would do art exhibits and any kind of community interest. So they're displaying Shields Green's skull. And so that's curious that they did that. Curious, and in a horrifying way. But as I looked at it, I concluded that when you look at the times where white Southerners were in the 1880s, they were hell bent on taking back what they believed themselves to have lost. They called it their redemption, which was a black man's hell. Their redemption was the black man's hell because Reconstruction was dashed. It had come to an end in the 1870s, and the rest of the period of the 19th century is just downhill fast for black people. Lynchings and all the unofficial wickedness and evil, as well as the legal and political taking back of power. And I think that Shields Green's skull was for them a relic of the past, in which they looked at it, and in some ways it was winsome for them. It brought them back to the days when their fathers and grandfathers were in charge, when black people were their slaves, and this is what they glorified. And to be blunt, a lot of folks like that, their descendants are still that way. They still take pleasure in their reflections upon the past. And this is one of the big problems, is that this nation and white society has never expressed a remorse. I mean, the Germans did a much better job. I mean, you can't find one statue in Germany that commemorates the Nazis. What you find all over Germany are statues that commemorate the victims and those who fought against it, and memorials for the victims. But here in the United States, the South is replete with statues, as we all know, of Southern people, and no apology for slavery, no remorse for what was done. And so in 1882, they've got the head of Shields Green displaying it as a point of curiosity, not for black people, for white people. And so it's more than barbarity. It is explicit white supremacist romanticization of the past. And I did find, after the book was done, I was guided to an article where it mentioned that the bodies were buried on some farm in Western Virginia. Apparently the headless body of Shields Green. Unless the body was dug up and the skull was removed at some later point, who knows? It's pretty gory. It's pretty awful. And poor John Anthony Copeland, they were interred in an anonymous grave. I don't know if we know where they are today, the body. But an article from, I think, the 1920s said that they had, a location of some of the raiders, and it had to have been those two men. So at any rate, that's kind of, where I look at it. Then I look at it through the lens of Reconstruction ending and the rise of the return of, white supremacy, Volume 2, which then, Shields Green becomes kind of this object of reflection. So, it sort of reminds me, every time you see paintings of St. Jerome, I teach history of Christianity. When you see paintings of Jerome, he always has, they often portray him as having a skull on his desk, and he's always pointing to the skull, and supposedly that's to remind us that life is not permanent, that we're all going into death. And in some ways, I think of this skull as being on the desk of history, as a reminder of the real truth about this country.
Mm.
The real nature of the United States, not make America great again, but this is what the United States is capable of doing to human beings. And then to deny it, suppress the truth and unrighteousness, like St. Paul says, and to lie about it and glorify it. But this is the real picture of, and in a real way, not just the South, but it's a real picture of the United States. So,
yeah, and so finally, so what can we take away from Emperor Shields Green's story? Like, what is his legacy?
Well, I believe his legacy is one of integrity, one of he is a gallant, valiant, brave freedom fighter. We need to resist any kind of treatment of Black people at any point in history as being reduced to, so we always have to push back against the narrative, the grand narrative of white supremacy, that when they're called slaves, we call them enslaved, because they were not slaves by definition. They were enslaved. When they are called whatever they're called, we remember that they're men and brothers and sisters and people of integrity and value. And then as Christians, we know that Shields Green is the image of God. And it reminds us that the image of God is not dispensed by white society. It's dispensed by the Almighty. And so if I was able to do anything by just telling his story, and again, it may prove that I may be proven wrong in some point, but I'd be happy to be proven wrong if more evidence comes to light. But what we can say is this was a man who gave his life, as insignificant as some people might think. He gave his life because he believed in the struggle, and that kind of struggle needs to be appreciated. He was a brave man. He was a brave man, and he died. And you know what? He suffered the same suffering. And like I say at the end, John Brown's soul goes marching on, but so does Shields Green. Shields Green's soul goes marching on. So, that's, my heartfelt way of just saying, yeah, he will be remembered, and he should be remembered.
All right, excellent. And again, I do appreciate this book. It's a great read, and it's very obvious, to me anyway, that you are making this persistent, intentional effort to flip, the narrative that would have him hammered down. And you're saying, no, you're upholding him as a person of dignity, who knew what he was doing and had his own agency, so to speak.
Amen. Amen. That's it.
So thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. DeCaro.
Oh, my pleasure. It's so nice to see you, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm excited to talk about the book, of course. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Faithfully Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to the show via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you'd like to join Faithfully Magazine in its mission to keep Christian media diverse, consider becoming a Faithfully Magazine partner subscriber. Partner subscribers, or FMPs, enjoy full access to our exclusive content and so much more. Just head to faithfullymagazine.com to learn more.